Thanks for being here today. I'm Shirley Bales, and I lead software ecosystem strategy at Intel. And yes, I did name this talk after a Cher song. I'm a product of my era. But today, we're not here to turn back time. We're here to look at signals, the ones that we've seen before, and ask what we'd do differently if we could do it all over again. Like a lot of you, I've spent most of my career in and around open source, not just the tech, but the people, the principles, and all the trade-offs that we've had to make to keep things moving. And after a while, you start to recognize the signs. You see the side projects that seem too niche until they quietly become infrastructure. You hear the government's debates that no one wants to have until they blow up everything. And you watch that weird little repo, the one that does the one thing well, and then one day it defines the entire stack. And you've probably seen it too, a tool that didn't seem like much, and then suddenly everyone's building on top of it. Maybe it was something inside your own org, or something that made its way into production while no one else was paying attention. And in hindsight, it feels obvious, but recognizing it in real time, that's really the hard part. And I think that we're in that moment again, right now, especially with AI, in developer tooling, in cloud and edge, and in the systems that we're betting the future on. So no, this isn't quite a nostalgia talk, even though there's a lot of italicizing. I'm not here to celebrate the past. I'm here to challenge the future. What did openness really enable? What did it make possible? Where did it fall short? And what's going to take to make it better this time around? So we built a lot on top of open. The cloud runs on it. Every developer builds on it. Most companies rely on it, whether they realize it or not. But that foundation isn't as stable as it looks. And a lot of what passes for open today is just surface level. APIs that change without warning, code that is technically open, but data that's locked down, foundations with governance that don't always reflect reality. The principles that helped us build resilient, scalable systems, things like composability, transparency, shared control, those don't enforce themselves. And when the pressure is on to ship, to scale, and to monetize, openness is usually the first thing to bend. And we're seeing that happen again, especially in AI, and especially in developer tooling. So before we go any further, let's take a step back. If we're going to talk about what open source means, we need to be honest about what it's actually done, of course, across the years, and how it's shaped the way we've built. So open source has never just been one thing. Sure, it's licensing, but it's also strategy, it's politics, and it's about who controls the ecosystem, who gets to participate. It's been used to build communities and to break into markets. It's been community-driven, but it's also been vendor-led. And that complexity isn't a problem. It's just reality. But if we're going to talk about what open means today, right now, especially in the high-stakes areas like AI, we need to be honest about what open source has done. It's shaped how infrastructure has gotten built. It's changed who could contribute and who got to lead. It created new expectations around interoperability, collaboration, transparency, and whether companies were ready for them or not. And the point here isn't to debate the purity, it's to understand leverage. Someone's coming through the wall. What did openness enable? What did it constrain? What lessons still matter to us as we build what's next? Because if we trace the actual history, not just the tools, but the power dynamics of open, we start to see a pattern, and it's one that's worth paying attention to. If you map the big shifts in software over the past few decades, you will notice a pattern. Open source doesn't just show up. It accelerates the moments where control changes hands. First with Linux, this was the foundation that changed who could run infrastructure and how. And then with software-defined networking, where we cracked open the control plane, automated policy, and shifted power away from proprietary hardware. Now, after that, containers and cloud native, where openness wasn't just about access to code anymore, It became a way to coordinate across ecosystems, across vendors, and build trust into the actual platform design. So some of you might be thinking that didn't web frameworks come before cloud native? And you're right, web frameworks did. But the reason that they're part of this sequence is particularly because of impact, not because of order. Cloud native was the turning point. When open source stopped being a set of standalone tools and started becoming a strategic model for ecosystems, only after that did we start to see developer experience take center stage, where individual developers could shape their own workflows, not just adopt the ones that were handed down. And now we're seeing a new wave. AI is challenging everything we thought we knew about openness, from access all the way to licensing, to data, and to governance. So this isn't about looking back and reminiscing about the past. It's about understanding the trade-offs that we've all lived and making better ones this time around. So we're going to walk through the arc, starting where it all began with Linux and the early OpenStack. So where it really starts, now we all know that Linux wasn't the first open source project, but it was the one that made people take open seriously, especially as infrastructure. It gave us a baseline, not just technically, but strategically. You didn't have to pay a vendor to experiment. You didn't have to ask permission to build. And that shifted all of the dynamic, especially in infrastructure. It also reset expectations around control. It started at the operating system level and working upward. And for the first time, open wasn't just a philosophy. It was a foundation that you could run a business on. So as we move through the next few eras, please keep this in mind. Every one of the waves that you'll see, from cloud native to AI, builds on the baseline that Linux helped create. So this was kind of fun for me to animate. My little animation. Anyway, what made this moment so powerful? It wasn't just Linux, right? It was the stack that formed around it. So this is where modularity really started to matter. The LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. It wasn't invented by any one company. There was no master roadmap, no single vendor controlling it, but it worked. You could mix and match components, you could scale parts independently, and most importantly, you didn't need permission from anyone to get started. That changed who could build and what they could afford to try. 2 developers in a garage could ship something that looked and felt like real infrastructure. You could host, deploy, and serve production traffic without locking into expensive licenses or proprietary hardware. This was the moment where open source stopped being an experiment and started becoming the foundation for modern software development. And then the clicker stops working. All right, then came the network layer, and with it, a bigger shift in how power actually moves through the stack. Up to this point, networks were hardware bound. Control lived in the box. Routing and switching were tightly coupled to the vendors that actually built them. And SDN changed that. For the first time, the control plane and the data plane were completely separated. You could run open source controllers. You could build network logic and software. And again, this wasn't a technical shift. It changed who could experiment, who could automate, who could build systems that spanned multiple vendors without asking permission. Networking started to look less like plumbing and more like a programmable platform. So here's what that shift looked like in practice. At the top, you had the business applications, the actual workloads that people were trying to run. In the middle, the control plane, now software-defined, and this is where intelligence lived. APIs, policy, logic, automation. And at the very bottom, the data plane, the physical gear moving packets through routers and switches. And with SDN, the intelligence moved out of the box and into the software. You could program the network. You could shape traffic in real time. You could optimize for latency, cost, security, all without touching physical hardware. And most importantly, you could do it with open source tooling. Projects like OpenFlow, ONUS, Open Daylight, imperfect, but directional. They made space for new players, new abstractions, and new expectations around what infrastructure could be. And maybe most importantly, they kicked off a broader conversation. What does it really mean to call infrastructure open? And who gets to decide? So with containers and cloud native, this was the moment when open source stopped being just a way to build infrastructure, and it started becoming a way to structure ecosystems. Docker was a spark. It made packaging and shipping software so much faster. But Kubernetes turned it into a platform, one that other tools could build on, extend, and plug into. Somebody's desperately trying to get into this room on the backside. What started as an orchestrator really quickly became a backbone for a broader system. Projects like Prometheus, Helm, Envoy, and OpenTelemetry, they weren't just adjacent. They were composable, coordinated, and ecosystem aligned from the very start. And that's really when open source shifted from these individual tools to ecosystems that built around shared interfaces and shared trust. And that's where the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, that's where they come in. The CNCF didn't just host projects. It provided structure, a public growth path, clear maturity stages, and open governance. And that structure is really what made scale possible. And we'll take a look at what that growth actually looks like. So I nicked this chart from someone sitting in here, from their talk from KubeCon in London. It was a hitchhiker's guide to the CNCF landscape. And it shows the growth of CNCF-hosted projects over time, from a few early projects to about over 200 today. Now, some of these graduated, some stalled, some are just getting started. And that's really what healthy ecosystems do. They evolve. But what matters more than the growth is how this happened, through shared APIs, through transparent decision-making, through developer-first design. These projects weren't only co-located, they were completely aligned. And that alignment is what the CNCF made possible. Not just neutral hosting, it was complete scaffolding, a public growth path, clear maturity signals, open governance. And it gave developers confidence. It gave companies something to bet on. And even when projects failed, and some did, they failed in public and on principle. And that's how trust gets built in open ecosystems, not just by releasing the code, but by showing your work. And that's the real lesson of Cloud Native. It's a well-structured open platform that can scale farther, faster, and it brings more people in than any single vendor could. So we have another chart here for you. While the cloud native ecosystem was expanding, something else was happening, and it started with developers. This chart shows a Dockerfile usage over time, and it doesn't just spike, it soars. And this is not just marketing, it's behavior, it's developer behavior. Developers weren't only just evaluating containers, this was adoption. They were adopting them, rewriting their workflows around them, expecting the same kind of modularity, the same velocity across the rest of the stack. And whether they realized it or not, these developers were sending a clear signal to the ecosystem. We weren't just moving fast, we were also moving differently, lighter, more composable, more developer first. And that shift in behavior, it created the pull for everything else that followed: orchestration, observability, developer experience, and even security. And this is what open source enables when it works well. It meets developers where they are, and it builds outwards from there. And that momentum, it didn't stop at infrastructure. It started showing up in tooling, in workflows, and in frameworks, reshaping the front end, the full stack, and everything else in between. So let's talk a little bit about how open source reshaped the developer experience itself. At some point, it stopped being just about what runs your application, and it started shaping how you actually build it. Frameworks, command line tools, local dev environments, testing infrastructure. Open source moved into every part of the developer workflow. And that mattered. It mattered because when tools were open, the feedback loops got shorter. Developers didn't just use the tools, They improved them, they forked them, they shaped the evolution. You'll start to see a different kind of innovation, one that's driven by practice and not by product cycles. And this is where developer experience, or DevX, stopped being an afterthought, and it started becoming a complete differentiator. And open source played a huge role in actually making that shift possible. So this was the moment open source shifted from infrastructure to experience. We're already seeing open source shape how things run, but here it started shaping how developers actually build. So you've got frameworks like jQuery and Angular, and they paved the way. And then React changed the mental model again and rewired how we think about all the components. After that, frameworks like Next, Nuxt, and Jamstack, they didn't just improve performance, they improved momentum. Every step in this timeline made the workflow faster for developers, lighter, more composable, and almost every tool along the way, open source. And these tools, they didn't just show up fully formed, they were shaped in real time, in the open, by people using them. They were forked, they were extended, they were argued over GitHub at 1 a.m. And that matters, because this wasn't just about convenience, it was about control. Developers could finally shape their own experience. And that shift from the dictated workflows to developer-shaped ecosystems, it's one of the most powerful things that open source has ever unlocked. And now that same mindset, the speed, the modularity, the flexibility, that's colliding with the most complex systems we've ever tried to make open, AI. So in this next era of AI and Gen AI, we've seen how openness has reshaped infrastructure, and we've seen how it reshaped developer experience. But this next frontier is completely different, because the thing that we want to make open now, it's not a tool chain, it's intelligence. And this is where things stop following the old playbook. Code was always easy to fork for most of you. You clone the repo, you tweak a few lines, you submit a pull request. But try doing that with training data, or with massive compute pipelines, or with how models are governed, or not governed at all. Standards were always hard, but in AI, the stakes are higher. The coordination is a lot messier, and yet we're still reaching for the same language that we've used for decades. Open models, open weights, open LLMs. But the truth is, keeping AI open is going to take more than just a license. And we're already watching that word start to stretch. And if we're not careful, open becomes open-ish. And the gap between what's promised and what's real, that starts to widen really fast. So this is where things start to get a little complicated. And for a while, it looked like AI might follow a familiar path, as we've already journeyed through. PyTorch was open. Hugging Face opened up tooling, data access, and community models. And it felt like openness was gaining some ground, the same kind of momentum that we saw in infrastructure and developer tools. But then the foundation models landed, and everything shifted. So in 2022, we got GPT 3.5, completely closed. All right, clicking away and flashing this at someone, sorry. There we go. Then 2023, it brings us GPT 4 and Claude. Same story, no weights, no transparency, no redistribution. Then late 23, Llama 2. You can download it, but it is not truly open. It's source available, with restrictions, and still very tightly controlled. And finally, in early 24, we start to see a little bit of a shift with Mistral, Mixtral, and some of the others. These models released under Apache 2.0, they weren't just accessible. They were openly licensed, redistributable, modifiable. And it felt like a return to these open source values. But the momentum is still early, and it's still so very fragile. And because when you step back and take a look at the timeline, one thing does become clear. In AI, open has mostly meant public availability, not shared governance, not transparency by default, and not long-term commitment. And that gap between what's available and what's actually open, it's something that we need to pay attention to now, because while the model landscape is still shaking out, the infrastructure story is already starting to follow a very different pattern. If we step back and look at all of this across infrastructure, DevX, and now AI, it is a difficult pattern to miss. Open source shows up early. It starts small, and it's a workaround. It's a side project, a tool that seems too niche to matter. But again and again, it becomes something more. It turns into infrastructure, into leverage, into a way for new developers, new companies, and new categories to participate in what's coming next. We've seen it with Linux, with Kubernetes, with developer tooling. And yes, we're seeing it in parts of the AI stack, but none of that momentum happens on its own. When open source works, it's not just because the code is clean or the code is clever, it's because it's strategically supported. It's governed, it's maintained, it's adopted and advanced by people who understand what's at stake. And it worked because people treated it like it mattered. And then when that support slips, the momentum doesn't actually disappear. It shifts, and it shifts towards something closed. So what does open source really do? We've talked about all these individual projects, and we've looked at broader patterns, at ecosystems that didn't just scale, but it shifted how software gets built in the first place. Underneath all of that is something really simple and really powerful. Open source is leverage. It's not just access to code, but it's access to momentum. It changes the balance of who gets to build, how fast can they move, and what actually becomes possible and for whom. A joint study from Harvard and Columbia had looked at some early stage startups, and just 2 open source contributions, just 2, were tied to a $100,000 increase in valuation. This was not from a business plan, this was not from headcount, and that says something about how much signal open source can actually carry, even when it looks small from the outside. It is a force multiplier, and for developers, for startups, and entire industries. But aside from that kind of, like any kind of leverage, when we think about leverage in those terms, it only works if you know you have it, and if you use it with intention. And that's why structure matters, why governance matters, and why community health isn't just a nice to have, it's infrastructure too. And because when openness is treated as strategic, it doesn't just support innovation, it reshapes who gets to lead it. So remember those signals that we talked about at the start, starting to show up again? And I want to make this clear that I'm not saying that Linux is the past and AI is the future. This is the best way to show this on a slide. But the tools that felt like side projects until they eventually became infrastructure, the governance conversations that got postponed until they're suddenly on fire, the tiny repos that did not look like much until they end up redefining an entire category. Hindsight is clean, or 2020, can we still say that? But the harder and more important question is, what would we do differently if we saw these patterns emerging again? Because lately it feels like we are, in AI, in developer tooling, in edge workloads, in climate tech, and in sovereign compute. So this isn't about nostalgia, it's about spotting the signals early enough so that we can make better choices the second time around. So what would you build differently? So that's really the question, right? Not just what you would build differently, but what would you notice sooner had you been given the opportunity? What would you push for earlier? What would you listen to before the stakes got really high? Because the signs, they're already here in the tools that we use and in the choices that we're all making and the ones that we're avoiding. We've seen what happens when open ecosystems are treated like an afterthought, and we've seen what's possible when they're treated like they matter. So if we care about what's coming next, and it's coming, whether we like it or not, we can't wait for someone else to get it right. We've got to show up now. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this talk, it's this. The past 25 years of open source, they weren't just a string of milestones. They were signals about how leverage forms, how ecosystems grow, and about how strategy shows up in all of the systems that we build, whether we plan for it or not. And recognizing those patterns, it isn't just helpful. It's how we make better choices before it's too late to matter. We don't get to turn back time, even if Cher says that we can, but we do get to recognize the actual patterns, and we get to make different choices. And if open source has taught us anything, it's that the future always belongs to the people who show up early. So, I don't know how quickly I went through that, but I will leave you with this. You don't need a title or a seat on a board or a foundation. You don't have to be part of a foundation to shape the future. Every decision that you make, the code that you use, the license that you check, the community that you show up for, that shapes what becomes the default. Vote with your work, support real openness, and show up for the scaffolding. We don't need one big lever, we need 1,000 small ones, pushed by the people who care. Thank you. All right, I think we have time. Does anyone have questions? Or comments, or want to sing, share? Have a little karaoke session. Okay. Well, we have a couple of goodies. Helper. Yeah. So anyway, we had some, just a couple of things to hand out if anyone had questions. So I'm not baiting you to ask questions so you get something. But yes, if there's anything that you want to think about governance or anything that you want to participate in or need resources.
What would you say about the pre-Linux days, right? I was expecting some to go back further, right? Because the internet had precursors, Linux as an operating system had precursors. Anything that you would say about pre-Linux?
Oh, fair point. My research didn't quite go back that far. I did start at the Linux stage of it just because I had 40 minutes and didn't quite expect myself to talk this quickly. I think really the premise in general for me is that being part of open for so many years in very different capacities, and I don't code in that sense, but just supporting the ecosystems, is that we are starting to see this shift where, okay, let's put it this way. How many of you here use an AI tool? Right, just about everyone. So for me, like there's ChatGPT, there's Claude, there's Perplexity, there's you know, and other than the coding and vibe coding, none of these platforms are talking to each other, right? So when I put something into ChatGPT and then I pit it against Perplexity, it's really quite interesting to see what one will say about the other, or say, well, this is an interesting thought, but have you considered this? So there's really, when we're trying to think about building the future for the next generation and whatnot, and even our future selves, none of these components and platforms, they're technically competing against each other, right? There's nothing shared. There's nothing to say, we're all in this together, even though there is this great expectation now that we're all to use these tools. Whose employer here has a requirement that you use AI in your job? Just two? Well, not required, sorry, wrong word. It's recommended that you keep up with the times and learn the tools, right? So we're all having to do that, because if we don't learn the thing, but the challenge is that all these tools are literally, they're individual tools. There's no collective. So there are conversations happening now around governance and whatnot, but in order to actually protect the ecosystem of the work, of the people doing the work, and also just the future of people before robots take over, I do think it's really important for us to start having the conversations that are still slow to get off the ground because of whatever the reasons are behind each of these companies and the projected financial impacts for Meta, for OpenAI, right? Everyone's got their own thing. And it's without this shared governance, how do we all know that we're building on the right thing? How do I know that ChatGPT is giving me the right advice if I did not think to go vet it against Claude or, is there anything else that anyone else is using? I mean, it's really the main ones, right? Sorry, oh yeah, Copilot, Gemini, right? So again, depending on which platform you're asking a question, you're going to get a slightly varied response. And when we think about that, when I was a kid, and we think about, right, we're going to make a phone call, it was a rotary phone. It was just this one, that was the one thing, right? But now as technology has taken over, there's many ways to make a phone call. And nobody knows really what a rotary phone is anymore, except for oldies like me. So when you look at that kind of analogy, right, you want to be able to teach the next generation that there is value in shared ideals and shared values and shared mind share. And how do we build something that's really, truly accessible to everyone and not just individual parts of the larger equation? Because then we're all doing different things and moving, instead of moving together, we're all moving in different parts and different times. Does that make sense? Yes, I knew you would.
So
You don't get a gift.
it's fine. So his question actually made me think.
Yeah.
So
Do you want to come up here so they can hear you?
I can be
John, does this work? Oh, he has a mic. Look at that.
Maybe this is a question for everyone. I don't know. But so this made me think of something, right? So when we think of the history of open source and Linux, well, the reason I think maybe we start with Linux is because Linux is what took it mainstream, and it made me think of like Twitter. Remember in the early days of Twitter when it was just a handful of weirdos and nerds, and then it became this huge thing because Obama was on Twitter and celebrities joined Twitter, and then it was like, oh, we don't care if you have 10,000 followers. Now it's 1 million.
Yeah.
So there's an analogy, I think, for AI applications, right? Because AI applications have become so mainstream now. And to me, it feels like the further the software community, and this is something I've observed with open source in particular, but the further the software community and the people building it get from those original ideals of open source, like when we were all a bunch of nerds together and we all could recite the 4 freedoms and we all remember that, right? The further we get from that, and it's like the horses are out of the barn,
Yep.
and it has a life of its own. So how do we as a community get the horses back in the barn to reset that conversation about AI so that instead of it being celebrities on Twitter controlling the future, it's the open source community that's a little bit more connected to our original ideals?
So I have a slightly different, right here.
Oh, hi. Sorry, he had his hand raised too.
I have a slightly different take on this. Back when Linux emerged, we had a lot of proprietary competing operating systems. And in the early days of open source, frankly, we didn't have a clear understanding of what the freedoms were or what it meant to be open. And everyone was generating their own license. And that was all about just software. Right? Now we've got arguably 17 artifacts associated with an AI system. And they need to be licensed. They need to convey, these things. And we have competing proprietary AI systems right now, like ChatGPT, like Claude, and so forth. But what we're seeing is that open is winning insofar as a lot of the public models that are coming out, even though we haven't quite figured out how to license them and so forth, the length of time, that time window for how long a frontier model that's proprietary performs at a certain level versus an open one has been shrinking.
Yes.
And it's gone from 12 to 18 months down to maybe 1 to 3 now. So maybe we're on track. We just haven't figured out the freedom part and how to do this sensibly. And I think the LFAI and data group is struggling with that, and the Generative AI Commons is struggling with this, and they're working on it. But I'm hopeful that this isn't starting to circle the drain, but that we're trying to converge here.
Right. No, and that's exactly it, right? There are a number of groups that are foundations, and even the OSI, everyone's starting to work on it, but everyone's working on it also individually in the individual areas. So there seems to be more of a larger collective in having a broader conversation, and how do we get there? Because those models are changing faster than we are actually able to have the conversations about governance and whatnot. So that's the concern, but that's exactly it, right? That's the call to action, is that we, as open source citizens, should work to keep participating, to keep having those conversations and work to put those forward. Because I think a lot of times people do feel that I'm not on a TAC, I'm not on the TSC, I'm not on a board, I have no seat at the table. But that's really not true. I think we all have a seat at the table. We just have to show up in different ways for it.
So maybe a contrary opinion. I work at NVIDIA, you work at Intel, right? So we're partially guilty in this whole situation.
Yes.
But I mean, I think the way I look at this, kind of similar to your point, that the vast majority of the work today gets done somewhere in the middle between far left, Richard Stallman, everything's free and nobody gets anything, and far right, used to be Microsoft, I don't know who it is now. And so I think we're at that point where you have to have the balance of, let's have the discussions about what freedom looks like. Thank you. You have to have the discussions about what freedom looks like, but then also enable competition. So I don't necessarily think competition is a bad thing, but it's how do we, like you said, draw people back into the pieces that need to be common, right? And we've seen this pattern happen with Linux. We've seen this pattern happen in the other things that you mentioned. So I don't think it's necessarily a competition versus free discussion. It's more, where do things happen in that middle plane between far left and far right?
Yeah, and I do think that the discourse is absolutely important. And that's part of the concern now, is how do we keep having that open discourse and then pushing that forward? Because I think the concern too is that you start to see that everyone's got their own little discourse happening in the separate groups. And so really my point is that when that starts to happen is when that fracture occurs, because we're all creating different answers to really the same problem. So it's really trying to figure out how can we all come together and, no one wants to form yet another foundation, but right, another board. But it's just, how do we ensure that there aren't just, I don't like the word, but I can't think of anything else right now, but individual cliques of groups of people having their own conversations, and we're not having it broadly enough. So, but thank you. Also, Guy, followed you for a long time, so I'm very chuffed that you're here today. Oh, hey. Hello.
Yeah, it's a sort of more granular question. You said that keeping AI open will take more than just a license, and then obviously you talked about that in like very broad terms. Can you speak to like where licensing is failing? Like maybe in an example of like open source licensing just like not working for LLM tech.
I'll be honest,
Gen AI tech.
I don't have exact examples off the top of my head for that, but we can. Oh, wait, sorry? Data. Oh, well, there you go. He does.
Well, data is a big example in my mind. It's so critical for AI, but it's not licensing-wise. And so from the perspective of data, there's just a lot going on that there is no license or paradigm. So software, I think we have permissive copyleft, that's good. There's still a variety of SSPL and exploratory, but data is so critical to AI, that's not even settled yet, and lots of different opinions there.
Yes, some large investments happening lately with like Meta, for example, buying up certain startups. I don't want to get too tech political about that, but that's a really good example of where that's not being governed and licensed. Oh, hi.
Sorry, I do have a question because we're talking about, for us trying to think about what would we do differently. From your research, have you found something that maybe like could have accelerated even the past? Could it be like governance or something like that? What do you think maybe we should learn that we were a little late at doing?
Yeah, and I don't think that we're necessarily late. This is more like a let's make sure that we're not too late to that conversation. And really, and I'm sorry, I think there's someone coming, the next speaker's here, but I really think that the general theme, and especially as someone who's been in open for as long as I have, is that it really is the power of the people, right? It comes, the most common theme in just about everything in life, really, but especially with open across the years, has been the maintainers, people that are just doing stuff at 1 a.m. out of their own conscience because they want to make things better. And I think that's really the common theme, is that people have invested their time, their energy for the greater good of whatever it is that they're building for their one small corner of the universe. So that was kind of what I said earlier too, is like, I think that each of us in our communities, across different communities, you know, whether you're, you know, Drupal or MySQL or, you know, Rust, Ruby, everybody has that responsibility to ensure that if they're not part of the conversation, to try to be part of the conversation and keep that conversation going and make that change. So I think that unifying factor is people. So anyway, next speaker's here, so I'm going to pack up shop. But I'm happy to chat in the hallway if you'd like. But thank you so much for joining.